Hey everyone, this is Tom, and this week's character is Ebon Shadestep for Doran. Another drow. Although I guess there's only been two, it feels like a lot more. But either way, it's actually been a lot of fun drawing drow. I haven't actually before I started this. I don't think I've ever really drawn one. I remember drawing Drizzt a couple times when I was a kid, but uh, never to completion. But anyway, they're fun. They're neat. They're a neat challenge. I'd like to take the concept further at some point, but when you're working with somebody uh, who um, who has a character already in mind, whether they're, in the case of R&D fantasy, and they're a player or a character creator or like a writer on a larger project, there is a level of expectation that you should be sort of leaning on a bit. You don't want to break their level of expectation or like sidestep them entirely unless they want something that's totally out of the box. But there's something to be said about the the sometimes not so plain fact that what I'm picturing in my mind is different from what you're picturing in your mind when you read a description of a character, and the difference between what's in your mind from anybody else's mind is going to be totally different. And even if they're like, and the more concise of an image that you have in mind, or the tighter the description, it can that can make things like the disparity between what the end result of somebody else's work interpreting your description is and what your description is can get crazier and crazier the more you go. um, and that's inescapable. The only way I can think to alleviate it would be if you were to sit in the same room as the person who created the character in the first place, and you would do loose sketches and doodles as they described. Basically, did a hot and cold the whole way through for the design, and then even then, there's so much compromise and give and take that you'll sort of both wind up with something that neither of you had in mind. Anyway, but all that to say that when it comes to character design and creature design and all that, mostly character design, there are certain benchmarks or certain bells that you gotta ring in order for it to feel like the character that was intended. Because I would love to take drow and design them as a species adapted to subterraneous life, living in darkness in caves, eating what could only exist down in darkness in caves. They wouldn't look like beautiful elves with great skin, all smooth and elegant looking and pointy features and happy, healthy. Well, they're not happy. Drow aren't. I wouldn't call them happy. But you know what I mean. They wouldn't be typical. But well, yeah, like I said, when somebody sends me a description of a drow, you know that they have an idea of a drow in their mind. But yeah, either way, I can go either way. It's all just great fun. But yeah, as far as the character goes, it was a fun change of pace. He's a character that spent a lot of time in Barovia, from the Ravenloft setting, which is a fun one, and I believe it recently got re-released or updated to the fifth edition rules. Haven't played it, but I'll be the first to admit the most of my experience in the Ravenloft world is from the Return to Castle Ravenloft, like the board game that came out a few years ago, which is still good. I mean, it's campy, but it's nostalgic. It's fun. Nowadays, I don't know so much, but yeah, it's a good setting, and that definitely I think comes through the design. At least that was my intent. But as far as this goes, as always, starting out with the notes of the character up at the top, just like the star points, the things like usually I reserve that for like actual physical objects or specific traits that need to be locked in. Sometimes I think I've actually done one or two where I didn't include them, but there's never been a time when I haven't gone through the notes, the whole description, and re-edited the document down to like 1 or 2 pages just so that as a quick glance I can look back and make sure that I'm not missing anything that I thought was most important. So I'll go over his... usually I wait until the point in the video where I'm just rendering stuff out, and it's just it's just a matter of time of watching things dilly-dally and just get rendered out. It's sort of like the more boring stage to watch, I'd imagine, but to read the description. But I think in this case, for the most part, especially most of Ebon's aspects of design are going to make more sense knowing more about him. So I'll go ahead and just read that out at the beginning, and we can go through. Because pretty much everything about... I mean, this is sort of the point of all concept art, but I think Ebon in particular... and I don't know why, he's not the most complex character I've drawn, but everything about him needed to be there for a reason in the way that it was, and it's all just based on his history and everything. So whether I got there or not, we'll see, but I'll go through it. So the email from Doran, let me see. So it was actually kind of funny. The description from Doran was about 4 pages, which is pretty average as far as that goes. And they said at the beginning of the email that they were guilty of being overly wordy about characters. So which, I mean, it's not an issue, but they tried to keep it streamlined. Although the record is, I think, like 13 or 14 pages from one of my friends. Years ago I did a character for them, and it was one of the most difficult things I've ever read. I'd make it public. I'd share it with everybody, but I wouldn't want to violate his trust. But it was very hard to understand. But so far, absolutely everyone has sent me great descriptions. These are really well thought out characters. Even though some of them I think are sort of made up on the spot, or sort of like either they're made up after the person wins, or they haven't been playing that long as them. But I have been very impressed with the robustness of these characters and the histories that people put into them. It's been great. All my characters have been largely just done for fun. Still taking the game seriously enough, but nothing as apparently as robust as a lot of these ones. But so I'll go into it now. So his name, Ebon Shadestep, which is an alias. His actual name is Vezethriliniar. Is a drow. He's male, 130-ish, young by elf standards, but old enough to have seen a lot of shit! ! Alignment neutral good. Yeah, sorry, he's one of those drow, in parentheses, which is good. I think good drow are the only interesting drow as far as I go. Anyway, that's just my own personal injection there. Base classes: Rogue 6, Ranger 4. Archetypes: Assassin and Stalker. The latter is a homebrew by Jeremy Forbing. Rangers equally at home in the city or the wilderness, who use unequaled powers of observation to act as investigators, spies, and vigilantes. Fun stuff. Stats: Strength 10, Dexterity 18, Constitution 12, Intelligence 10, Wisdom 14, Charisma 16. Skill proficiencies: Animal Handling, Athletics, Deception, Insight, Investigation, Nature, Perception, Persuasion, Stealth, Survival, Disguise Kit, Thieves' Tools, Prisoner's Kit. Poisoner's Kit, sorry. Gameplay-wise, I play him more rogue than ranger, basically. He's the party's hitman, but more often he's their scout lookout. Sneaking ahead to check things out, spying on people from a distance, keeping watch at night, etc. Nothing gets by him unnoticed. So for his equipment, his armor is studded leather, nothing fancy or special. His weapons: the Baal Versailles dagger, his primary weapon. It's a nasty-looking blade, with the handle and sheath made of skin, and enchanted to allow him to become invisible for a few seconds. Various plain silver daggers. He has so many knives. Compact hand crossbow, etc. He's got a lantern of Elistre, a holy relic given to him by the goddess of that name. It's plain looking and small enough that he wears it on his belt, but when lit, it glows with moonlight and dispels magical darkness. And he's got a lot of vials of poison appearance, which I didn't include much of. I only hinted at the vials, but I'll get into that as we go. Actually, I'm glad I'm reading this stuff out earlier. Appearance. I don't want to give too many appearance notes because I'd love for you to go wild. Facially, I've always pictured him looking more sharp and angular than a typical elf. I know you've said in videos recently you want to push more stylized features, so there you go. He wears his hair shoulder blade length and usually just pulled back in a ponytail, but it can be down if that works better for you. His eyes are totally white, the way cataracted eyes look. He's blind. I'll save details for the history section, but physically his eyes are blind. However, he's still able to see via a magical sense. Think something like Daredevil or Demon Hunters in Warcraft, etc. Actually, that reminds me of Paul Muad'Dib from Dune. In later, as the books go, I don't remember which. It's been oh my goodness, it's been 12 years since I read them. But in the books, Paul Atreides, the main character of Dune, and I think it's in the second book, but he shows up again. Maybe the third book. I think it's the second one though. But he's blind, but he has basically psychic abilities to tell the future. He can prophesy and everything, but he can move around and do things and fight and kick butt, no problem. Even though his eyes don't work, because what he's basically doing is using his psychic ability, or his his psychic ability to see the future like a millisecond ahead of time. So he's basically just looking into his own future by a fraction of a second, so he just knows exactly what's going on. But anyway, that made me think of Paul Muad'Dib when I read that. Anyway, armor-wise, I don't have any specific references. The closest thing I have in mind is silhouettes like Assassin's Creed that have form-fitting armor and draping fabric, but please design what you feel fits best regardless of this. He's naturally dresses in dark colors, but it doesn't have to necessarily be all black. He has a pet raven that's usually chilling on his shoulder, but if you feel like including it, but by no means is that required. Typically, I don't include familiars along with the characters because they also, even if it's a simple animal, they do take a lot of time and consideration and development as far as that goes. Another problem too is like, if it's a raven and it's sort of a simple raven or a plain raven, that could go by pretty quickly, even though feathers are really hard to get right. But see, if I draw a simple raven, then I'm going to have to draw everybody else's familiars, and some people have like griffins and dragons and wyverns and giant harpies or harpy eagle type things, and that could add like another 4 to 6 hours easily. So that's why I don't. But usually, if they come up in the description, I'll usually try to include some sort of hint that they have a familiar that's just not pictured with them. The last time that was done, it was forgive me for not remembering the name, but it was the plain elf with the white hair. He did have I believe a hawk that would perch on his shoulders. I didn't draw the hawk, but I did draw a little bit of torn or like worn out frayed fabric where the hawk's talons would go on his shoulder pad. So look out for stuff like that if you ever include a description of your animal friends. I'll usually try to include a visual note for them. So history. Apologies ahead of time for how lengthy this is. I tried to condense it as much as possible, but it still ended up long. Haha. And then an emoticon of a person on their side. Some guy laying, maybe it's a dead man? I can't remember. Anyway, don't worry guys, it's not too long. Ebon was born into a drow house called House Rilnyar. Man, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. RilYnar. Rilyanar. I'll leave it there. They weren't so much a noble house, more like a black network or mafia-esque setup. They were known for being assassins, spies, scouts, infiltrators, etc. In typical drow fashion, the house was run by women, but in this case they were also all scions. It let them ensure absolute loyalty. When someone returned from a mission, the matrons could dive right into his mind to see exactly how the mission went. Training was extremely intense and unforgiving, with a high mortality rate. Dudes didn't really have an identity and were deliberately dehumanized and treated less like people and more like tools. Ebon himself excelled at training, and during that period of his life, he could have passed for your average ruthless killer drow because he was brainwashed, hey. Once he graduated and began taking on legit assignments, he essentially had his eyes opened. The curse of conscience, he calls it. Assignments basically were what showed him exactly how messed up his people could be, but also showed him there were good drow out there as well. He constantly struggled to hide any remorse, guilt, or sympathetic tendencies from the scion matrons, and this led to a lifelong fear of having his mind invaded. During this period, he began hearing the call most drow hear from the goddess Elestrae. While he obviously couldn't openly worship her or seek out anyone else who did, it was essentially the spark of what would become a very important religion to him. When Ebon was around 100, the whole house was wiped out. He had no idea what caused it, only that one night a large number of armed forces from various noble houses converged on them, put any they could find to the sword, and pursued any escapees across the Underdark. Ebon himself only narrowly got away, spent a harrowing number of weeks on the run through the tunnels, and eventually made for the surface out of desperation. He was found and taken in by a caravan of traders. They weren't exactly the best people, essentially a troop of mountebanks, but they accepted him readily, and that stuck with them. He spent a good 10 years traveling with these people and getting used to the surface, and essentially finally developing an identity for himself. After that, he left to pursue his own path. Along the way, he found a temple of Elestrae, and although he didn't stick around, he was able to finally accept that particular calling in his life. Over the past few decades, he's kept up his skills by offering himself as a hired assassin for people who need someone dead, but will notably only accept a job if the target is genuinely a terrible person that deserves it. Basically a vigilante. He also goes out of his way to follow Elestrae's teachings, helping other outcasts find their way, etc. As far as my current D&D campaign goes, he fell in with a super ragtag group consisting of a tiefling cleric, a half-elf fighter warlock, and a human werewolf. What a crazy group, right? We're doing the Curse of Strahd campaign, so they were all hired to investigate odd werewolf sightings, and it led to them being trapped in the good old gothic horror lands of Barovia. Ebon had spent their time in Barovia essentially trying to rally all of the various outcast and downtrodden groups against the land's vampire overlord. Were-ravens, the good werewolves, a bunch of elves, etc. He's like a weird drow Robin Hood. One notable event was discovering the evil branch of werewolves in Barovia that they were sent to investigate all worship a deity named Mother Night, who turned out to be Elestrae. He essentially had the goddess appear to him, encouraging him to get rid of their leader, which is where he got the lantern mentioned in the equipment section. Let me tell you, a drow and a werewolf having a religious debate was a riot. The other notable event was their venturing to a particularly dark temple, wherein an entity offered to grant Ebon a shielded mind. It would prevent him from ever having his head invaded again, like in his youth. He took it at the cost of his physical eyesight, so that's why he's blind. Currently, they're all in Ravenloft to kill Strahd, so we'll see if Ebon's still even alive in a few weeks. Personality. Oh yeah, then there's another emoticon of the eyes and then the tongue sticking out, the capital P, capital P, personality. To paint him in a broad stroke, he's essentially your typical rogue with a heart of gold. On the surface, if you meet him at a tavern, he acts pretty uncharacteristic for a drow. He's upbeat and smarmy, very sociable, prone to cracking dry sarcastic jokes, things like that. Essentially, it's a big performance. Where he initially had a quick temper when people were ugly or racist towards him, he eventually realized that it was much easier to talk his way out of it and act like it didn't bother him. And by extension, it did actually stop bothering him. Fake it till you make it. He picked the name Ebon Shadestep for himself, half because people can't pronounce his real name, as I proved by accident, and half because it's a funny name. It's memorable, and if people are going to judge him for being a drow, he's going to make a joke of it. Getting to know him, however, he's a lot more serious. The party's time in Barovia has basically left him pretty dour and melodramatic, lol. He's an overly suspicious person and slow to trust, although his first instincts about people, good or bad, tend to be correct. However, once you've gotten on his good side, he's your friend for life, and he'd take a blade for you without hesitation. He feels very strongly about helping underdogs because he remembers what it was like to be in a terrible situation himself. Naturally, he takes it extremely poorly if he's not able to do anything to help. In Barovia, a lot of people have gotten killed around the party. He's taken it personally, and it's left him in a bad place. On the flip side, the more typical drow-like part of himself shows itself around bad people. He takes way too much pleasure in killing terrible villains to the point of it being scary for his party members, but he sees it as doing it justice. I'm terrible at describing personality, so I asked a friend in the campaign to give it a shot, and here's what he sent about Ebon. Well-meaning but stubborn. Believes he is entitled to be stubborn because he has seen a lot go down in his life and doesn't wish the past to repeat itself. The best plan is a well-thought-out plan. It can be self-righteous, but it comes from a desire to help. Vengeful when he feels injustice has been committed, unwilling to compromise on matters of ideals, concerned about the well-being of people more than he always shows. All true. As Doran comes back in to interject. That's it. Actually, this last bit here, this was this sort of struck me, this idea that Doran had, because they were having a tough time of describing their character, and that can really happen. The more intimate you are with a character, the more difficult it is to really sum them up. It's sort of like, as an example, it's like if you ever look through all the description, like if you look at like a personality type test, and you do the test, and it tells you like what your personality is and stuff. If you read them thinking about your friends, you can nail them. You can just pick one, and it'll be him, and you pick another, and it'll be him, and that guy, and all these other friends, and you'll be able to sort of sum them up and assign them. But when you read it for yourself, you can see yourself aligning with all of them to some degree, and you're like, well, I'm kind of like number 2, I was sort of like number 4, but I really like number 8. You know, all that stuff. That happens a lot with characters too. It can be really tough to really define them if you know them super well. But getting somebody else, one of your friends who's familiar with the character, and who's actually seen how they act, who's actually seen how they get through situations from the outside, they do a really good job that's so much more sharp and less biased, such a good job of describing the character for you, that if you're having trouble coming up with your description for your character, do this. Play some games, and get a friend who's familiar with your character to do a little, like a paragraph, like 4, 5, 6 sentences long, and I think you might be surprised and pleased. I think this was a very good call. And even if you're like a writer, like a young writer or something, I would say that this would be a great way to really pin down the characters. It's really important to define who a character is before you start writing for them or playing them. I mean, you can play D&D without getting this too much into it, but playing them as an actor, or as a movie or a play or something. Good call, Doran. Very good. I was impressed with that. So anyway, that's the description of Doran. Pretty cool guy. I guess now it's I figured I'd go through all the different details and choices that I made as I went. So as far as the face goes, I really started enjoying rendering faces out, with adding as many little lumps and curves and bumps and things, and trying to lately, for the last few of these, I've been trying to do do them without any reference at all, whether it's anatomy or clothing or what have you. Although sometimes, usually for like certain super wrinkly things, I'll definitely look up reference just to make sure. But just trying to flex my memory muscles of things like how the facial muscles and skull structure go, and seeing. Doing that, I'm paying close attention to stuff that I second guess myself with, or things that I don't feel quite right about. But it's been a good exercise to just try to use my memory and just try to stand on those legs. Sometimes using reference, I think, could be it could be called like sort of like training wheels if you rely on them too much. I mean, you should use it as often as you possibly can, because it just amplifies your art so much. But it's good for developing your quick drawing skills, your quick sketching, because like you can sit there and paint anything really amazing in 40 hours or 80 hours, but if you need to do a quick concept in like an hour before a meeting that you didn't know about is coming up, or you just you're in a meeting and it'd be nice to like get an idea just quickly, have like an initial sketch done up while everybody's in the room and you don't have to chase everybody down. Quick drawing skills are absolutely essential, especially if you're going to be working in the games industry. I mean, of course it's not a requirement. It's not going to get you not hired, but it's definitely a huge strength. It's something that I look for whenever we've been looking for artists. I think that if you can draw something relatively well quickly, then you can draw something even better when given a long time. But if you need a long time to draw something well, you won't be able to do it well quickly. Aside from that, reference is absolutely critical. As much as you can use it, you should. Before you start a project, gather reference, and save stuff up and keep it well organized. Have a reference folder, set it up, things like anatomy, costume, environment, and then subcategories, subfolders, however it works best for you. But having like a good repository of reference is important. Although I've gotten into the habit of just using Pinterest. For the most part, Pinterest is a great place, but it's also really risky because you'll get a lot of crossover with other concept artists out there, and that's one of the problems I have with using the internet for reference at all. I mean, it's a huge place, it's a great place, it's an incredible reference, literally, but the problem is everybody's looking at the same place. Everybody's getting all their reference from the same pile, and I think it's starting to make everything feel very samey. Even though there's so much good, great original, so much fantastic work out there, I think it just gets risky, especially for young bloods coming up that want to get in. They're not thinking that much into it. They don't know enough history and reality to sort of offset this stuff. I've seen so many people use video game characters and movie props as reference for their designs, and to me, I find that reprehensible. Even ethically, like it's somebody else. Like I'm the number one enemy of that horrible line. Good artists copy, great artists steal. I've always hated that. I always hate copying. I always hate stealing. I don't do it. If I ever do it, and I'm certainly not aware of it. I look down my nose actually at that, and I'm very openly smug about it. But the problem is if you have a million concept artists in the world, and say 50% of those working on a fantasy game, and all of those games have a knight with armor, and people look up plate armor or medieval armor, and they're all going to be taken by Google by the hand to all the same 5 websites at most, the same Google image search results, and they're all going to be basing their ideas off of this overall sort of consistent theme, this idea. And this is I mean, I've mentioned this topic before, but it's another reason why, if you're going to be using reference, if you need reference, go to the library, go to books, old stinky books, go to as big of a library as you can. It's worth the trip to go to like a downtown library or like any sort of main library. And the reason why, and it's getting better as years go by, but the reason why is that when an image gets put, has to go all through the process of passing the muster and all the work and effort that goes into making websites and things. The pictures that go up onto websites, at least for now, are things that summarize subjects very well. Like, so if you look up ancient Egypt, it's the example I always use. You look up ancient Egypt and you go to websites, and it's like you've got the obelisks, you've got the pyramids, you got the Sphinx, you got Cleopatra, you got Imhotep, and a couple other things that everybody. And King Tut's mask. And you've got all, like, probably like a dozen, 2 dozen artifacts or images that are just completely ubiquitous, and it's like, Sally's ancient Egypt site, and there's just a handful. There's just a tiny, like, couple hundred different ancient Egypt things that really summarize the whole thing to, like, make up a website. Even Wikipedia, they don't have that much for many things as far as images go. But with a book, if you go to the library and you look up a book on ancient Egypt, there's going to be full of pictures of artifacts that are just as Egyptian, that have just the same amount of vibe and texture quality and just like all the stuff that makes reference pictures worthwhile. But it's going to be stuff that people aren't seeing at all, because it's such an obscure little trinket or an idol or hieroglyph or sculpture or weapon that it's off the beaten path enough. It's not something from major history or something of celebrity, so it doesn't get, no one bothers to put it up online, but it's still just as super Egyptian. And so if you were doing something for like an ancient Egyptian game, you'd be finding reference for stuff that is just as Egyptian-y, but it totally sidestep everybody else's expectations. It's totally working outside the realm of the person who just goes to Google and just types in ancient Egypt, like Egyptian artifacts, whatever, you're totally undercutting them. Like they're working at the top of the iceberg, but you know that the real source is under the water, and the library is the underside of the iceberg. Actually, I could have just summed it all up with that. The library, if you're looking for a reference, the library is the part of the iceberg that's under the water. But anyway, back to the character of Ebon Shadestep. Speaking of face, yeah. Looking back on it now, I could see myself pushing the face being much more angular. I don't want him to look like Crichton from Red Dwarf. And I don't want him to look like just too pointy and needly. When I think of angular, I often think more of just very thin and sort of gaunt, like visible cheekbones. I can't remember the name of the muscles, but the ones that go from the cheekbone to the corner of the mouth, those things sort of sticking out. And I think, or like a thin, a narrow, pointy nose, that sort of stuff. To me, that sort of spells angular, but I'll admit that I can definitely push it further in that regard, but fun nonetheless. As far as everything else has sort of a part based on the description and everything. The jacket itself that he has, he just mentioned the desire for the silhouette to be sort of like Assassin's Creed, with like form-fitting parts and flowing fabric-y parts. In this case, I kept everything more or less leather. You're based on it's sort of like a highwayman jacket from my guess is 17th, 18th century France. It's sort of got like the drop-down flaps. It's an outdoor jacket, high collar. It's sort of like a more of like a gentlemanly. What's it called now? A duster, like one of those rancher jackets, but slender and form-fitting. Something when you have a character that's like an assassin, or a hitman, especially like a classier one. It makes sense to have like these longer tails, a bit of flowing fabric. There are a few classes where I'm guaranteed to draw them with some flowy fabric, and that's usually things like wizards, rangers, for the most part rogues. They just have to have, in my mind, in my opinion, they just have to have a little bit of that there. So it was good that it was already included in the description. Even him being a member of what Doran described as a mafia family. It sort of lent as an inspiration there as being someone a bit more upper class and expensive looking, a bit more ritzy. So underneath his jacket, which is it's pretty fancy. I'd imagine it'd be sort of expensive jacket, even though it is quite simple as far as that goes. But he's got these spats on his shoes. Spats, like I was thinking of like 1920s sort of mobster mafia. I mean, the idea of like the mafia is like something from like The Godfather is basically a fiction. But in the 20s there was a lot like Al Capone kind of mobsters. There was a lot of this sort of like more upper class type guys with suits and pinstripes, and so that's coming up. I mean, the stripes get painted in right near the end, but so he's got pinstripe pants. Think of like 1920s mobster, but then a nice fancy red silk vest, tie, high collar. High collar always reads class, sort of like more in like a Mr. Darcy sort of way. That also makes it look a little bit older. You don't want it to look something like from the 1800s. You got to push it back further. So going with that old like Edwardian era, or no, further than that. I always get the British eras mixed up. But even like gloves. Gloves to me make sense. It's something a bit more like stylish and classy. It hides fingerprints. Actually, let me see if I can find it. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'll give up on that. Yeah. So it hides fingerprints, and it just sort of goes classier, and it's also a nice little bit of color. Let's see what else we can go through. I mean, I'm sort of trying to. Okay. So yeah, knives and daggers. When having a large array of daggers like this, I think in my mind it sort of automatically set it as something sort of like more like an array of throwing daggers. It would be good to have. I mean, it would be certainly cool to have a whole bunch of different like knives just all over the place. But this guy is, well, he is an assassin and he is fighting werewolves. I mean, he is also he's a hitman. He's stealthy. He's he sneaks around. But if you had somebody walking around in a town or a city and he's covered in knives, I mean, everybody's got a sword or an axe. Like, people are used to seeing weapons, but when he's covered in knives, that's going to send a message. I would cross the street if somebody covered in knives was walking towards me. So I didn't want them to go too crazy. And I mean, his outfit already is quite ornate. It's already pretty packed. He does have high dexterity, so you don't want too many things, too many places, because then it just gets impractical and dangerous for yourself. So having an array of sort of more throwing daggery things, just down on the side, almost, sort of like, I mean, that it is basically where he's keeping all of his knives. I'm imagining him also having some on the other side as well. I could see him almost like throwing them, like grabbing them over and over again, like a whole bunch, almost like a gun, a standoff with guns in the Wild West. The simple leather studded armor, I did keep very simple, and even sort of understudded. There's studs here and there throughout, but I didn't go too crazy. I wanted something that just hugged tight to the body, as per the description. And then this little stem here that goes over the shoulder, this is where the crow, his raven familiar, would perch, and that's what that's for. So like I said earlier, it's nice to have little clues to the things that I couldn't include, such as in this case a raven. But it's sort of like I didn't want to just put like a twig or put like claw marks there on the shoulder. I wanted it to be something a little bit more formal, a little bit more manufactured. It's something that he probably had custom installed just to accommodate his pet there. But I imagine it sort of swooping back towards his backside there. Could offer at least even some sort of little bit of protection, even just from like anything slicing his shoulder pad. Now, even as far as it goes with these, I don't know what the technical term for it is, but these little strips of like extra leather at the bottom of his jacket to add those little, like those pointy strips that are riveted on, and even the ones up on his shoulder, on his shoulder pad there. Those really are more just sort of there for flavor, really. I don't know if things like that would have any sort of practical means, but there is a huge aspect of character design. It's even like one of the absolute most fundamental things of just silhouette and interesting silhouette, and making sure that you're disrupting it, and it's not too blocky, not too bulgy, not too even, not too chaotic. But this is a great way to add a little bit of that gothic horror look. Things are a little bit scraggly here and there, a little bit messy, a little bit wild. There's something that would add a lot of animation to his movements, or a lot of movements to his animation. I don't know, but they give him a little bit more of a raw edge, something that isn't quite so just tame and dull. It's a way to break up the silhouette, and also it gives it some of that eclectic fantasy look. If things are too neat and too orderly, they tend to not look as fantasy enough. I just got a simple silk tie. Don't need to draw too much attention to it. Although if you've never done it, I recommend looking into the history of the necktie. It's actually quite cool. It's about like mercenaries and cool gangs and stuff. Very old-timey stuff. So yeah, now that I've got the rendering done on the one main layer, the occlusion layer, which is an approach that I'm really actually starting to quite like. It simplifies things quite a lot, especially when it comes to the rendering stage, because all the rendering is now done. I just gotta basically add color and then do touch-ups. But now at this point I've just got all the silver done up and moving around. I wanted every bit of metal that's on this character, since he deals with werewolves, to be silver. It seems a wise choice because of what silver does to werewolves. I was even thinking as far as like the thread that I add later on being some sort of like silver metallic thread, rather than any sort of other color. So yeah, here's the pinstripes. Stripes are annoying to do as long as you well, they're not too annoying as long as you allow yourself to make some mistakes and not be perfect. Don't worry about being too perfect. Once you have them all in, they'll look perfect enough. And as long as they're all wonky enough, then they'll work a lot better. But if you try to get them too perfect, it can just go crazy. Unless you're really good at stripes and you can do them perfect, then do it. Yeah, that was more for just the ex-mafia setup or aesthetic. A lot of this is trying to figure out sort of materials as I go, like how much color is going to be involved. I knew that I wanted something color-wise that was vampiric, something that went along with like the Barovian, the Strahd sort of legacy. So they've sort of broken away from it a little bit now that I can remember from looking at the book quickly. But the Strahd stuff with all the vampires and Barovia, to me it's all purple and red and orange from fire. And purple and red is like not only a perfect color scheme for vampiric stuff, but also for drow in general. I mean, they've got purpley skin, they've got purpley hair, they've got purpley clothes, they got like red eyes usually. So it was really a very fitting color scheme that all just happened to have some legs to stand on from the get-go. Now he's got this buzzed out section of his hair, and later on I add some tattoos around that go through it, and then down his temple a bit. And in the description you might remember a part where it said that this is why he's blind, is that he grew up with the fear of having his mind invaded, which he then got resolved. But I imagined him having, at least before having that curse lifted, or having his eyesight taken away to get that fixed, he could have had some sort of like sigils of warding of psychic spells and mind reading stuff that he had hired some deranged wizard or some sort of arcane tattooist to tattoo into his scalp around his brain, sort of where the scions would like grab the side of his head and start trying to think, but they'd be blocked out. And so, he keeps them visible. He touches up the hairdo. He still sort of likes having it. He'd probably sort of attach to it, but having the tattoos around his skull visible, I thought would be a neat way. And also to break up just simple long hair pulled back into a ponytail, which, depending on the character, can look cool, but I think it could have been I just don't think it just sort of plain straight long hair, straight or like plain long hair on this character was enough. He needed something a bit more edgy. He does have an edgy quality to his character. He is somewhat lighthearted, but he is worn down. He is affected by his time out in Barovia. I would be. It's a pretty rough place, pretty rough spot. So even pushing the aesthetic further, this is like a good happenstance where it fits with the Barovian Strahd aesthetic, but it also works almost cheesily well with the Drow. Is this spiderweb motif in the stitching on the inside of his lapels here. It's good because it's got that campy horror look that Barovia is laden with, but it also is almost like stereotypically Drow with their worship of Lolth, like this big spider deity. Another place where I was sort of trying to go for that was the belt that he has for his primary dagger. It is made of leather, but it's got sort of like a more like web-like shape to it. It's not just a strip, but it's got like a fractured membranous sort of grosser sort of feel to it. He is still Drow. So then just sort of like a little understated hip lantern that he has here. Metal always makes me nervous. There's a lot of stuff that I always feel super intimidated by when I start going into it. Probably fabric is my number one. But metal can also be super daunting. I don't know if I have any particular advice at this time about how to depict metal. I usually just try to power through it. And actually a little bit of advice, even on this one here, I didn't actually have a design in mind. I just sort of had a vibe in mind when I was working on it. But what I recommend for this sort of stuff, and I think it would probably work for almost everything, but rendering general to specific. So you might have noticed that I just started with like this pill shape, or this slug shape. Actually shaped sort of like a rubber bullet. But I started off with just flat pill shape, and then I started rendering that pill shape, and it was just this general pill shape. And then once I felt that I'd had the shape of that sort of figured out, I went and I started warping the rendering of it. And because the pill shape rendering was sufficient for what it was, as I started playing with the rendering that was on it, it started, in my mind and how I was interpreting it, it started to affect the shape that it was reflecting in my mind. So I was able, by working out where the shadows were, my mind was interpreting the shape of this object, and it was sort of like a push-pull, a matter of pushing and pulling the tone until I saw what sort of shape would work well, and my mind was interpreting how the shape was working, and that was just a byproduct of working general to specific. It just sort of popped out that way, and then gave it some legs so it can stand, and just some nice subtle little windows, not too big, not too small. And one of the challenges with the method I've been using now with the occlusion layer on top of all the color is that you'll need to, especially on skin, you'll need to do some paint over stuff on top of it just to make sure that it's not too flat, not too dull. So if you just have plain black shadows in there, it can really kill the color, really kill the vitality of things. And you'll need to want to make sure that that gets overwritten. So you can colorize shadows, but you're going to need to touch up stuff over top. Unless you're awesome at this. And then let me know and I'll watch your movies and learn how to be a lot better. So I did the description of the cataracts in the eyes. It was a little bit confusing because he mentioned the eyes were all white and then mentioned that they were cataracted, and that's sort of a different thing. I liked the idea a lot of having just plain white eyes. But because cataracts were mentioned twice, I felt that I decided I'd better err on the side of literalism there. So I sort of tried to meet halfway in the middle, where there's still a little bit of the typical drow purple iris, but they are largely mostly white. So they are washed out, but the pupils take precedence. I once knew a man who, I don't remember if he had surgery on if he had to have his lenses removed or he had some sort of old-timey cataract surgery, but he had artificial lenses put in his eyes, and it had a neat effect of when he looked directly at you, it was almost like he had the tapedom of an animal behind his eyes, and the light was reflecting back at you, so his pupils would sort of flicker silvery gray. And it was pretty cool, very cool looking. He described how he didn't have any depth perception anymore, even though he had both his eyes working. He had surgery in both of those eyes, but I didn't want to ask him too many questions about it in case he didn't want to talk about it. But yeah, it was a very neat look. It always stuck with me. So this is another time when painting over and lighting is good. Even just adding this one single solid color of lighting around an edge can do wonders. This is something the habit that I took up after watching Joy Ang work. Her characters often have like this classical lighting scenario where it's nice sort of diffuse lighting from direction above the camera usually, and then a harder light from the background. I really got to focus on getting better at that. It's just such a perfect way to light a scene. So since he's been going around Barovia, he's getting worn out. He's getting worn down. It's affecting his personality. I thought it'd be really good to include just a layer of grit and grime and grub, just dirt that's splashed out in the mud in the rain, fighting vampires and werewolves all night and day, and I knew that he just needed to be dirty, and it's a good look to go with like an outfit designed for like a classier sort of mafia outfit that's all just worn out. He's actually living in these clothes. It also does, I'll admit, just sort of help make things look a little bit more fantasy. If things are too clean, they don't look fantasy enough, especially with sort of a genre bending setting like Barovia. It's the campy horror with like D&D fantasy. You're gonna need to make as many of those bridges between those two as you can, and I think just something as simple as gritty and grime can do it. It's older sort of just hints at cracking leather. Yes, he's an older guy. He's been at this for decades and decades, so his stuff's going to be starting to fall apart. Now, as far as this dagger goes, there is something described about them online. Apparently, the skin that they are encased in, or they're sheathed in, is taken from the body of whoever they kill first, which is pretty cool. In this case, just because I wanted it to read as skin, I just made it sort of like a default skin color. I would picture anything like human skin when it's been dried. There are examples online of books that have been bound in human skin, and it becomes quite brown and caramel colored. But I wanted to keep this stuff light, just to help make it read a bit more clearly. I mean, you could even say that like it was cured so well that it's going to stay like pale and softly colored. And it's not going to age or like brown like paper or anything. Or, he's fighting at night, and the sword isn't out during the day very much, so it's not going to get tanned. If it's got some sort of weird magical level of... it is a magic weapon, so it might have some sort of level of life of some sort still to it. But even to help make it look a little bit more like skin, I did add just one thin line of like an orangey brown, just to give it a little bit of subsurface scattering. It's not going to be any blood running through there, but there is going to be some light scattering. And then this was a new one. I've never tried painting this before. Like on his jacket here, just something that I just wanted it to look like he may have come out of the rain. So his jacket is wet and partially glossy. I think it actually I think it worked, but I was surprised. I've never tried that before, but I was just trying to think it out. So here are the tattoos for around his head. So that's where that's where those are coming from. Yeah, if all his hair is going to be white, I think his eyelashes have to be white too. I don't recall seeing drow too often. I mean, I'm sure people are... I'm not like blowing any minds by giving them white eyelashes, but I don't really recall I've ever seen... It is also rare that people draw characters with eyelashes. At least male characters, anyway. It's hard to make it look right unless the rest of the face is realistic enough. It just won't look right. So yeah, he's got the vials of poison. Is similar reason why I didn't want to add a bunch of knives everywhere, is because then here's the just a hint at the handheld crossbow behind his back. Not really any sort of place to fit it, and I see it more as like a secondary item. But yeah, you don't want to have a bunch of vials of poison everywhere. They're going to be chinkling and tinkling, and the risk of breaking is really bad. And if they're a vial of poison and they shatter and they cut you while they've got poison, then you could be screwed. So I put just a hint of one on the inside of his jacket, almost like if he opened up his jacket, it would be like the pirated watch salesman guy down in like old timey New York. He's got all the watches and stuff inside his trench coat. He'd have some sort of basically an apothecary inside his jacket. And then the ones on the outside, I don't remember what group it is, but in the Middle East in the olden days, there were guys who would have charges and cartridges for rifles on their jacket. They still sort of harken back to it in that area of the world. I just can't remember which group it was, but these like nice, like these cool vertical cartridges on their front of their chests. And I thought that'd be a good place for some poison, but also even just whatever part of the vial you can still see that's not just in the leather, being metallic. So it's like a less shatterable vial of poison, something much more manageable. So anyway, hopefully I got through almost everything, but this was a joy to draw. This was Ebon Shadestep for Doran, and I had a blast drawing this character. I like him a lot. But this was for the free weekly character art lottery that I hold every Monday on Twitter, or every Sunday and Monday on Twitter. I just let you know what hashtag to tweet before Tuesday, and if you get randomly selected, then you win, and I draw your original fantasy pen and paper RPG characters, role-playing RPG, yeah, free of charge, just like this. And I do all this, and it's really fun, and you're welcome. And it's R&D Fantasy at Twitter. And anyway, I hope everybody liked it. Hope it helped. Thanks.